3 days after the duel, Una stood in front of the memorial wall in the station's observation deck, a small brush in her hand and a pot of ink resting on the ledge beside her. The wall stretched for hundreds of meters in both directions, covered with names written in dozens of different scripts. And it served as a reminder of everyone who had died in the conflicts that had shaped galactic history over the past 10,000 years. Most of the names belonged to species she had never heard of, civilizations that had risen and fallen while humanity was still learning to farm and build cities. But there was a small section near the bottom that had been set aside for the newest members of the galactic community. She dipped her brush in the ink and carefully wrote 2 Korean characters on the smooth white surface of the wall. Park Jinwoo. Her brother's name looked small and lonely against the vast expanse of alien symbols, but she knew that it belonged here among all the others who had given their lives in the endless struggle between species. "I did it," she whispered, and her voice cracked on the words despite her best efforts to stay composed. "I proved what you always believed, that nothing in the universe is beyond human reach if we refuse to accept the limits others place upon us." She thought about the idealistic young man who had believed so strongly in communication and understanding, and she wondered what he would think of what she had done. Would he be proud of her for defeating the beings who had killed him? Or would he be disappointed that she had used violence instead of finding the common ground he had always sought? She suspected he would have felt both emotions at once, because that was the kind of person Jinwoo had always been, capable of holding contradictory feelings without letting either one overwhelm the other. He would be proud, a voice said from behind her, and she turned to find Subcommander Vrex standing at a respectful distance with his mandibles held in a posture of sympathy. "You did not know him," she replied, but there was no hostility in her voice, only the weariness of someone who had carried grief for too long. "No," Rex agreed, and he moved to stand beside her in front of the memorial wall. "But I know what he believed, because you told me during our conversation yesterday. And I know that he believed humans were capable of changing the galaxy through their unique strengths." Una nodded, remembering the long discussion she had shared with the Chitrax officer about humanity's potential role in galactic affairs. He had come to her quarters to formally thank her for saving his species from Valorum domination, and they had ended up talking for hours about everything from military strategy to philosophy to the strange foods that each of their species considered delicacies. The Chitrax Collective would like to propose a military exchange program with Earth, Rex continued, and she heard the careful formality in his translated voice that indicated an official diplomatic communication. "We believe that human combat techniques could be valuable to our warriors, and in exchange, we would share our knowledge of void combat and ship-to-ship tactics." It was an extraordinary offer, the kind of alliance that Earth's diplomats had been seeking for years without success, and Una understood that it was only the first of many such proposals that would come flooding. And now that humanity had proven itself capable of challenging galactic powers, "I will speak with Ambassador Chai about your proposal," she said. And Rex clicked his mandibles in satisfaction before departing with a bow that his species reserved for honored equals. She turned back to the memorial wall and touched her brother's name one final time, then made her way to the private meeting room where Kethun was waiting for her. The Valorum overseer had shrunk even further since their duel, his form now barely larger than a human body, and she wondered if the damage she had inflicted was permanent or if he would eventually recover his former magnificence. "Thank you for coming," he said, and his voice carried none of the arrogance that had defined every word he spoke before their confrontation. "I have questions that only you can answer, and I was not certain you would be willing to speak with me after what happened between our species." Yuna took a seat across from him and studied his diminished form with an expression that was carefully neutral. "Ask your questions," she replied. And she saw something that might have been gratitude flicker through his swirling essence. "How did you know?" he asked. And she could hear the genuine confusion in his voice. "How did you know that we could be cut?" When no one else in the galaxy has ever discovered this weakness in 10,000 years of conflict, Yuna considered the question for a long moment before answering. "I did not know," she admitted. And she saw surprise ripple through Kethium's form at her words. "I suspected, because my grandmother taught me that nothing in any world is truly beyond the reach of a properly wielded blade. But I did not know for certain until I felt my sword create that disturbance in your essence during our duel. You risked your life on a suspicion," Kethium said, and his voice carried something that sounded almost like admiration. "You challenged an enemy that no one had ever defeated, based on nothing more than the teachings of a dead woman and your own faith in human capability. My brother died believing that humans could find common ground with any species," Yuna replied, and she felt the old grief rise in her chest, but controlled it with the discipline her grandmother had taught her. "I was not willing to let his faith be proven wrong, so I found a different kind of common ground, one that you could not dismiss or ignore." Kethium was silent for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was heavy with an emotion that her translator struggled to identify. "We killed your brother," he said. "And it was not a question, but a statement of fact. We killed him to demonstrate our power. And you came here seeking revenge for his death." "I came here seeking proof," Yuna corrected him. And she saw confusion ripple through his form at the distinction. "Revenge would have required me to kill you, but that was never my intention. Because killing you would have proven nothing except that humans are capable of destruction." "Then what proof did you seek?" Kethium asked, and his form leaned toward her with an intensity that was now curious rather than threatening. Yuna thought about her grandmother's final words, spoken on her deathbed while the autumn leaves fell outside her window like they had fallen during every training session of Yuna's youth. "I wanted to prove that humans are capable of growth," she answered, and she saw understanding begin to dawn in Kethium's swirling consciousness. "My grandmother taught me that the true purpose of the sword is not to destroy enemies, but to cut away the barriers that prevent understanding. And the greatest barrier between humans and Valorum has always been your belief that we are beneath your notice. We can no longer hold that belief," Kethium admitted, and his form contracted in what she recognized as the Valorum expression of humble acknowledgement. "You have cut that barrier away more effectively than any diplomat could have done with words alone." Yuna rose from her seat and moved toward the door, but she paused before leaving and turned back to face the being who had once been her greatest enemy. "My brother believed that every species has something they value, something they fear, and something that connects them to the rest of us," she said. And she saw Kethium's form pulse with attention at her words. "He was killed before he could find those connections with your species. But perhaps his death created the opportunity for those connections to be formed after all." She left the overseer alone with his thoughts and walked to the observation deck where Ambassador Chai was waiting for her with a datapad full of messages from Earth. "The government wants to know what you plan to do next," he said, and she could hear the careful neutrality in his voice that indicated he was asking the question for himself as much as for their superiors. "You have become the most famous human in the galaxy overnight, and everyone wants to know how you will use that fame." Yuna looked out at the stars that sparkled beyond the station's windows, each one representing a world that might someday need to learn the same lesson she had taught the Valorum. "I intend to teach," she answered, and she touched the handle of her grandmother's sword one final time. Not just swordsmanship, but the principle behind it. That the universe is made of space, and humans have always been masters of claiming space as their own. Ambassador Chai nodded slowly, and she saw respect in his eyes that had not been there before their arrival at this station, far away. On worlds she had never visited and among species she had never met. The story was already spreading of the human who cut the air itself, and the darkness that still remembered her blade, and somewhere in the vast emptiness between stars. Her grandmother's spirit smiled at the granddaughter who had finally understood what the sword was truly for. The laughter of the Veloran delegation filled the great hall like the sound of wind howling through broken windows. And Yuna stood perfectly still while wave after wave of mockery washed over her from every direction. She had expected this reaction, had prepared herself for the humiliation of being dismissed as nothing more than entertainment for beings who considered themselves gods of the atmosphere itself. But the sting of their contempt still burned beneath her skin. Ambassador Chai had grabbed her arm and was whispering urgent warnings about diplomatic consequences and the fragile nature of humanity's position in the galactic community. But Yuna gently removed his hand and kept her eyes fixed on the swirling darkness of Overseer Cathium. "You wish to cut me," Cathium repeated, and his form stretched and contracted in what she recognized as the Velorum expression of deep amusement. No species has ever harmed a Velorum in personal combat. Little human, not in 10,000 years of galactic history. And you believe that you will be the first. "I believe I will try," Yuna answered. And her grandmother's blade remained steady in her grip, despite the trembling she felt in her heart. The other delegations had begun placing wagers through their private communication channels, and she did not need to access those channels to know that the odds were overwhelmingly against her survival. A species made of air could not be cut by any blade ever forged, because blades required something solid to bite into, and the Velorum would simply flow around any attack like smoke parting before a hand. Everyone in the galaxy knew this fundamental truth, and everyone in the galaxy was about to watch Yuna Park die for daring to challenge it. Cathium drifted toward the central platform and expanded his form until he resembled a thundercloud, pregnant with lightning and ready to unleash destruction upon the world below. "I accept your challenge," he declared, and the amusement in his voice had sharpened into something that sounded almost like hunger. "It has been many centuries since I have tasted the fear of a dying enemy, and I suspect that human fear will be particularly sweet." Yuna stepped onto the platform and assumed the basic ready stance her grandmother had taught her when she was only 6 years old. Her feet shoulder-width apart, and her sword held in a two-handed grip at her center line. She remembered standing in the training hall behind her grandmother's house in Jeongju, wooden sword clutched in her small hands while autumn leaves fell around them like orange and red snow. And her grandmother's voice cutting through the cold morning air with words that would shape her entire life. "The sword does not cut the enemy," her grandmother had said, reaching down to adjust Yuna's grip with hands that were weathered and strong despite her 70 years of life. "This is the secret that separates true masters from those who merely wave sharp metal around and hope for the best." Young Yuna had frowned in confusion, because cutting enemies seemed like exactly what swords were designed to do. And her grandmother had smiled at the expression on her face. "The sword cuts the space where the enemy exists," her grandmother continued, and she drew her own blade in a motion so fast that Yuna's eyes could not track it. "Master the space, child, and nothing in this world or any other world will be beyond your blade." Yuna had spent 20 years learning what those words truly meant, training until her arms burned and her hands bled, and her mind entered states of focus so deep that the world around her seemed to slow down and reveal its hidden structure. She had learned to feel the weight and resistance of empty air, to sense the invisible currents that flowed around every solid object, to understand that the space between things was not nothing but was instead the medium through which all movement happened. and now she stood facing an enemy made entirely of that space. That air, that atmosphere which she had spent her entire adult life learning to perceive and manipulate with her grandmother's blade. Kethium began his attack without warning. And suddenly, the air around Yuna became a weapon trying to crush the life from her body. The pressure differential hit her like a physical blow, and she felt blood vessels burst in her eyes as the oxygen was pulled from the space around her face and replaced with a vacuum that made her ears scream in agony. The Valorum Overseer was not playing with her as he had played with the Chitrax warrior, because something in her stance or her eyes had warned him that this human might be slightly more dangerous than the insects who had challenged him before. Yuna did not try to breathe, because there was nothing to breathe, and instead she held the air in her lungs and focused her attention on the patterns of movement within Kethium's gaseous form. He was not formless at all. She realized with a surge of hope that pushed back against the darkness creeping into the edges of her vision. He was made of currents and densities and pressure differentials, just like the wind that blew through the mountains of her homeland. And wind was something that humans had learned to understand thousands of years ago. She swung her grandmother's blade in a horizontal arc, not aiming at Kethium himself, but at the space he occupied. And the edge of the sword created a disturbance in the atmosphere that rippled outward. Like a wave in still water, Kethium's form shuddered, and the pressure around Yuna's head suddenly lessened enough for her to gasp a single breath of life-giving oxygen. What was that? The Overseer demanded. And for the first time since the challenge began, there was something other than contempt in his voice. The other delegations had stopped their quiet conversations and were now watching with expressions of shock and disbelief, because they had all seen the impossible happen right before their eyes. A human had made a Valorum feel something, had disrupted the perfect flow of a being made of air itself. And suddenly, the outcome of this duel no longer seemed quite so certain. Sub-Commander Vrex of the Chitrax Collective leaned forward in his seat, his compound eyes reflecting the light of the platform. And Yuna caught a glimpse of something that might have been hope in his alien features. She did not have time to appreciate the moment, because Kethium was attacking again with renewed fury. And this time he was not holding back anything at all. The Overseer compressed himself into a dense spiral of darkness and slammed into Yuna with the force of a hurricane concentrated into a space the size of a human body, and she felt her ribs crack under the impact as she was thrown backward across the platform. She rolled with the blow as her grandmother had taught her, converting the energy of the impact into motion that brought her back to her feet. And she tasted blood in her mouth, but her grip on the sword never wavered. "You are stronger than I expected," Kethium admitted, and his form began to change into something far more dangerous than the casual shape he had worn before. "But strength is not enough to defeat a Valorum, and I am tired of playing games with you." The lights in the great hall began to dim as the Overseer drew all available atmosphere toward himself, pulling oxygen and nitrogen and every other gas particle into his expanding form until he blocked out the artificial sun. Entirely darkness fell across the platform, and Yuna could no longer see her enemy or her sword or even her own hands in front of her face. "You cannot cut what you cannot see," Kethium's voice echoed from everywhere and nowhere at once. "And you cannot cut darkness itself, human, no matter how sharp your blade or how skilled your technique." Yuna closed her eyes, because they were useless in this absolute blackness anyway, and she felt the displacement of air against her skin as Kethium moved around her like a predator circling wounded prey. "I do not need to cut the darkness," she answered, and her voice was steady despite the fear pounding through her veins. "I only need to cut what hides within it." She raised her grandmother's sword and prepared for the final exchange that would determine whether humanity would be remembered as victims or as something far more dangerous. The silence in the great hall stretched for what felt like hours. though in reality, only a few seconds passed before the chaos began. Kethium's two halves were slowly drifting back toward each other. But the process was clearly agonizing for the ancient being, and his form flickered and shuddered with each tiny movement like a flame fighting against a strong wind. Yuna remained standing on the platform with her grandmother's sword held loosely at her side, her chest heaving as she finally allowed herself to breathe the oxygen that had returned to the air around her. Blood dripped from her nose and ears and the corners of her eyes, and her vision swam with dark spots that warned her she was close to losing consciousness. But she refused to fall until she was certain the fight was truly over. The Valorum delegation surged forward in a wave of swirling darkness, their collective voice rising in frequencies that made the walls of the station vibrate with barely contained fury. "This duel is invalid," they screamed in unison, their forms merging and separating in patterns the Yuna's translator device identified as extreme emotional distress. The human used forbidden techniques. She violated the ancient laws. "We demand that the result be overturned." Ambassador Chai stepped forward before Yuna could respond, and his voice was calm and steady despite the trembling she could see in his hands. "The ancient laws state that any method of combat is permitted during a demonstration duel," he said, and he pulled a small device from his pocket that projected the relevant sections of galactic law into the air above the platform. "The laws specifically note that there are no restrictions on weapons, techniques, or approaches, because the purpose of the duel is to demonstrate the true extent of each combatant's capability." The Chitrax delegation buzzed in what Yuna's translator identified as enthusiastic agreement, and Subcommander Vrex rose from his seat to address the assembly. The human followed every rule of the challenge, he declared, his mandibles clicking in emphatic punctuation. She announced her intention. She stepped onto the platform, and she defeated the Valorum Overseer through superior skill and understanding of the fundamental nature of combat. Other delegations began to add their voices to the debate, some supporting the Valorum position and others siding with the Chitrax interpretation. And soon the great hall was filled with a cacophony of alien languages, all arguing about whether Unipark had just changed the balance of power in the galaxy. Forever, Yuna tuned out the noise and focused on Kethium, who had finally managed to rejoin his two halves into a single coherent form. The Overseer looked diminished somehow, smaller and less imposing than he had been at the start of the duel. And when his gaze turned toward her, she saw something in his expression that made her heart race with a combination of satisfaction and unease. He was afraid of her now, truly afraid in a way that a being of his age and power had probably never experienced before. And that fear would either make him cautious or make him desperate. "How did you do it?" Kethium asked, and his voice was quiet enough that only Yuna could hear him over the shouting of the other delegations. "No solid blade can cut air. This is a fundamental truth of physics. And yet, you cut me in a way that I did not believe was possible." Yuna sheathed her grandmother's sword and met the Overseer's gaze without flinching. "You were wrong about what I was trying to cut," she answered, and she saw confusion ripple through his form at her words. "I was not trying to cut your body, because you are correct that air cannot be cut by steel." "Then, what did you cut?" Kethium demanded, and his form leaned toward her with an intensity that might have been threatening if she had not already proven that she could hurt him. "I cut the space you occupied," Yuna said, and she saw understanding begin to dawn in the swirling patterns of his consciousness. "My grandmother taught me that the sword does not strike the enemy, but strikes the space where the enemy exists. And if the cut is fast enough and precise enough, then even air cannot flow around it in time." Kethium was silent for a long moment, processing her words. And when he spoke again, his voice carried a weight of emotion that she had never expected to hear from a being who had seemed so wholly superior just minutes before. "You created a vacuum," he said slowly, And she nodded in confirmation, a void so absolute and so perfectly shaped that my essence could not flow through it. And for that single instant I was divided in a way that should have been impossible. My grandmother spent her entire life perfecting that technique, Yuna replied. And she felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes as she remembered the old woman who had given her everything she needed to stand in this moment. She called it the cut between moments, the strike that exists in the space between one heartbeat and the next. The great hall had grown quieter as the other delegations realized that the two combatants were speaking to each other. And soon every translator device in the room was straining to pick up their conversation. Catham drew himself up to his full height, though he still seemed diminished compared to his earlier magnificence. And he turned to address the assembly in a voice that resonated through every corner of the station. "The duel is valid," he announced. And the Valorum delegation made sounds of protest that he silenced with a sharp pulse of pressure. I was defeated fairly according to the ancient laws, and I will not dishonor myself further by claiming otherwise. The Chitrax delegation erupted in clicking applause, and Sub-Commander Vrex made a gesture that Yuna's translator identified as the highest form of respect that his species could offer to a non-Chitrax individual ambassador. Chai was staring at her with an expression that mixed pride with something that looked almost like fear. And she understood his concern perfectly well. She had just demonstrated that humanity was capable of threatening the most powerful species in the galactic community. And that demonstration would have consequences that extended far beyond the territorial dispute that had brought them all to this summit. The other delegations were already updating their assessments of Earth's strategic value. She could see it in the way they looked at her and whispered among themselves. And she knew that humanity would never again be dismissed as irrelevant newcomers to the galactic stage. Cathium approached her once more, and this time there was no hostility in his movements, only a strange respect that seemed foreign on a being who had shown nothing but contempt for solid species, just ours. The Valorum expanse withdraws its territorial claim to the Verith systems, he said loudly. Enough for the entire assembly to hear. We will not contest the Chitrax presence there, and we will reevaluate our approach to all future disputes with species that have proven they can challenge us. The words were a massive concession, the kind of diplomatic victory that Earth had never achieved before. And Yuna saw Ambassador Chai's eyes widen as he realized the magnitude of what had just happened. There is one more matter, Cathium continued, and his form contracted slightly in what she recognized as the Valorum equivalent of hesitation. I wish to speak with you privately, human, when the summit has concluded. Yuna met his gaze and saw something in those swirling depths that surprised her more than anything else that had happened during this impossible day. The being who had killed her brother, the enemy she had sworn to destroy, was looking at her not with hatred or fear or wounded pride, but with genuine curiosity and what might even have been the beginning of respect. "I will meet with you," she agreed. And she saw relief flicker through his form at her words. "But not today, because today I need to rest and remember why I came here in the first place." She touched the handle of her grandmother's sword one final time, drawing strength from the connection to everyone who had carried this blade before her. And then she walked off the platform on legs that trembled with exhaustion but refused to buckle beneath her. Behind her, the galaxy had changed forever, and she was only beginning to understand what that change would mean. The darkness was absolute and complete, and utterly terrifying. But Yuna had trained for this moment without even knowing she was training for it. And her grandmother's voice echoed through her memory, like a lantern guiding her through the blackness. "Close your eyes," her grandmother had commanded during one of their final training sessions together, when the cancer had already begun its slow destruction of her body. but her spirit remained as fierce as ever. The sword does not need your eyes to find its target. Yuna had obeyed. Standing blindfolded in the training hall, while her grandmother circled around her and attacked from unexpected angles with the practice sword. She had failed dozens of times that first day, taking hits to her arms and legs and torso that left bruises lasting for weeks. But she had refused to give up because she could see in her grandmother's eyes that this lesson mattered more than any other. Feel the air. Her grandmother had instructed, tapping Yuna's exposed forearm with the tip of her practice blade. Every movement displaces the atmosphere around it, and that displacement creates pressure that your skin can detect if you learn to pay attention. It had taken months of practice before Yuna could reliably block attacks she could not see, and years more before she could counterattack with precision against opponents, moving through complete darkness. Now all of that training was the only thing keeping her alive as Kethium flowed around her in the lightless void of the great hall, probing her defenses and searching for the opening that would allow him to crush the life from her body. She could feel him moving, feel the subtle pressure differentials created by his gaseous form as it shifted and swirled through the space around her. And her sword tracked his movements with the instinctive accuracy of 10,000 hours of practice. Kethium struck from her left side, and she pivoted and cut through the space where his concentrated form was passing. And again she felt the blade create a disturbance in his essence that made him recoil in what she now recognized as genuine pain. Impossible, the overseer snarled, and his voice carried a new emotion that the translation device struggled to process before settling on a word that surprised everyone who heard it. Fear. The being who had terrorized the galaxy for millennia, who had killed Yuna's brother without a moment of hesitation, who had claimed that no solid species could ever challenge the supremacy of the Valorum expanse, was afraid of a human woman with an old sword. Yuna did not allow herself to feel triumph, because the fight was far from over, and Kethium was learning from every exchange. He attacked again, this time splitting his form into dozens of smaller streams that came at her from every direction simultaneously, and she could not block them all no matter how fast she moved. The first stream hit her shoulder like a hammer blow and spun her half around, and the second struck her hip and nearly knocked her off her feet. And by the time she regained her balance, she was bleeding from a dozen small wounds where the concentrated pressure had torn her skin. Her lungs were burning from the lack of oxygen, because Kethium had not released his grip on the atmosphere even while attacking. And she knew that she could not survive much longer in this state of desperate defense. She needed to end this fight quickly, or she would die like her brother had died, gasping for air that would not come while her enemy watched with cold satisfaction. The thought of Jinwoo gave her strength, even as her body weakened, and she remembered the last conversation they had shared before he left for the diplomatic mission that would kill him. "I really believe we can find common ground with any species," he had said, his young face bright with hope and idealism that she had always admired even when she could not share it. Even the Valorum must have something they value, something they fear, something that connects them to the rest of us. He had been wrong about finding common ground, but he had been right about the Valorum having something they feared. And Yuna was proving that truth with every swing of her grandmother's blade. She stopped moving and planted her feet firmly on the platform, sword held in a ready position that would allow her to strike in any direction at maximum speed. And she let her breathing slow even though there was barely any oxygen left for her to breathe. Kethium sensed the change in her stance and paused. His attacks, confused by the sudden stillness of his prey. "You accept your death?" he asked. And his voice was cautious now in a way that it had never been before. "I accept nothing," Yuna replied. And she sheathed her grandmother's sword in the scabbard at her hip. The gesture confused Kethium even more, because it made no sense to put away your weapon in the middle of a fight for your life. And his hesitation gave Yuna the moment she needed to enter the deepest state of focus she had ever achieved. Her grandmother had called it the moment between heartbeats, the infinite instant where time seemed to stop and the sword and the wielder became one single unified intention. Yuna felt the world around her crystallize into perfect clarity despite the complete absence of light, and she could suddenly perceive Cathum's entire form with a precision that went beyond any normal human sense. He was not formless chaos as he appeared to be, but was instead a complex pattern of densities and currents that flowed around a central core of consciousness. And that core was the only part of him that truly mattered. If she could strike that core, if she could cut through the space where his awareness existed, she could hurt him in ways that no Valorum had ever been hurt before. Cathum must have sensed the danger, because he suddenly compressed himself into the densest, most concentrated form possible and launched himself at her with the full killing intent of a being who had decided that entertainment was no longer worth the risk. Yuna's hand dropped to the handle of her grandmother's sword, and in one motion she drew the blade and cut upward through the darkness in the technique her grandmother had called the rising moon. The cut was not aimed at Cathum's physical form, because his physical form could flow around any blade and reform without damage. Instead, she cut the space where his consciousness resided, the invisible center around which all his particles organized themselves. And the edge of her blade moved so fast that it created a vacuum in its wake that even a being of pure atmosphere could not flow through for one impossible microsecond. Cathum's awareness was bisected by a wall of absolute nothing, a void within the void that separated his mind into two unconnected halves. The scream that emerged from the overseer was not a sound that could be translated, because it was not a scream of pain but a scream of existential horror from a being who had just discovered that it could be divided against itself. The darkness shattered as Cathum lost control of the atmosphere he'd been hoarding, and light flooded back into the great hall to reveal a scene that would be remembered for millennia. The Valorum overseer hung in the air as two separate clouds of darkness, each one trying desperately to reconnect with the other. And between them stood a giantess, human woman with blood running down her face and a sword that still gleamed with the impossible light of a blade that had cut the uncuttable. The great hall was completely silent except for the agonized sounds of Cathum slowly pulling himself back together. And every species present stared at Yuna Park with expressions that ranged from disbelief to terror to something that might have been worship. She had done what no one in galactic history had ever done before. She had made a Valoran bleed. The diplomatic station called Verith Prime floated in the empty space between three contested star systems, and Commander Yuna Park stood at the observation window, watching ships arrive from dozens of worlds she had never visited. She was not supposed to be here as anything more than a ceremonial guard, a symbol of Earth's new presence among the galactic powers. But she had learned long ago that ceremonies often turned into something far more dangerous than anyone expected. Ambassador Dohan Chai stood beside her, adjusting the translation device clipped to his collar and frowning at the gathering crowd of alien delegates in the great hall below them. "The Valorum delegation has arrived," he said quietly, and Yuna noticed how his voice carried a slight tremor that had nothing to do with the cold, recycled air of the station. She had read the briefing files on the journey here, and she understood his concern perfectly well. The Valorum were not like other species in the galactic community, for they possessed no solid bodies at all and existed as clouds of sentient, atmospheric particles that could reshape themselves at will and flow through any space that contained breathable air. They had conquered 17 worlds without ever firing a weapon, simply by threatening to withdraw oxygen from the lungs of anyone who opposed them. And no species had ever found a way to fight back against enemies made of the very air their victims needed to survive. I want you to stay close to me during the summit, Ambassador Chai continued. And Yuna nodded without taking her eyes off the swirling dark shapes that were entering the great hall through specially designed atmospheric vents, of course. Ambassador, she replied, and her hand moved unconsciously to rest on the long wrap bundle hanging at her hip. It was her grandmother's sword, a blade that had been in her family for 7 generations. And she had promised herself she would never travel without it after what had happened to her brother 5 years ago. The memory still burned inside her chest like a coal that refused to grow cold. Jinwoo had been only 23 when he joined the first Earth delegation to meet with the Valorum Expanse, young and eager and convinced that humanity could find common ground with any species if they only tried hard enough to communicate. The Valorum had listened to his passionate speech about cooperation and mutual respect, and then they had demonstrated their power by slowly removing every molecule of oxygen from his lungs, while the other delegates watched in frozen horror. They called it a lesson in understanding hierarchy, and they had laughed when Jinwoo collapsed and stopped breathing forever. Yuna had sworn that day that she would find a way to make them understand that humans were not creatures to be dismissed and destroyed on a whim. But she had never imagined she would actually stand in the same room with the beings who had murdered her brother. The summit is beginning, Ambassador Chai said, and they descended the curved staircase into the great hall together. The hall was arranged in a massive circle with delegations from 30 different species occupying their designated areas. And in the center stood a raised platform where disputes would be settled through the ancient galactic tradition of demonstration. Rather than warfare, Yuna took her position behind the ambassador's chair and studied the other delegations with careful attention. The Chitrax Collective had sent a full military escort, their insectoid bodies covered in ceremonial armor that clicked and rattled whenever they moved. And she could see from their rigid postures that they were deeply afraid of what was about to happen. They were the ones who had called this summit, desperate to challenge the Valorum claim over 3-star systems that the Chitrax had colonized centuries before the gaseous beings had even evolved intelligence. The Valorum delegation occupied no chairs at all, but instead hovered as a massive dark cloud near the center of the room, occasionally forming shapes that resembled faces or limbs before dissolving back into formless mist. Their leader, Overseer Kethium, separated himself from the collective mass and flowed toward the central platform, his voice emerging from the air itself in a sound that made Yuna's teeth ache. "We have come to settle this territorial dispute in the traditional manner," Kethium announced, and his form shifted into something that almost looked like a humanoid figure made of smoke and shadow. "The Chitrax claim that they have rights to the Varith systems, but they cannot enforce those rights against us, and therefore those rights do not exist." A Chitrax warrior stepped forward onto the platform, his mandibles clicking in what Yuna's translator identified as formal challenge language. And for a moment she allowed herself to hope that perhaps the insectoid species had found some way to fight back against the Valorum. That hope died quickly. Kethim flowed around the Chitrax warrior like water surrounding a stone, and within seconds the warrior began to shake and gasp as the air was pulled from his breathing spiracles. The other Chitrax delegates buzzed in distress, but none of them moved to help, because they all knew that anyone who stepped onto the platform would suffer the same fate. The warrior collapsed after 30 seconds, unconscious but still alive, because Kethium wanted to make a point rather than a corpse. "This is the reality of power in this galaxy," the Valorum overseer declared. and his form expanded until he filled nearly a quarter of the great hall. No solid-bodied species can challenge us, because how can you fight what you cannot touch? And how can you strike what flows around your blows like morning mist? Yuna felt her fingers tighten around the wrapped handle of her grandmother's sword. And she heard her grandmother's voice in her memory, speaking words that she had repeated 10,000 times during training. The sword does not cut the enemy. Her grandmother had always said, it cuts the space where the enemy exists. And if you master the space, then nothing in any world is beyond your blade. Ambassador Chai was speaking now, trying to find diplomatic words that might salvage something from this disaster. But Cthulhu interrupted him with a sound like thunder rolling through storm clouds. And what could humans possibly contribute to this discussion? The overseer asked. And his tone made it clear that he expected no answer worth hearing. Your species has been part of the galactic community for less than one standard decade, and you have no power, no technology, and no capability that could change the fundamental truth I have demonstrated here today. Yuna thought of Jinwoo, gasping for air that would not come, and she thought of her grandmother's sword waiting patiently at her hip. And she thought of every time someone had told her that something was impossible, only for her to prove them wrong. She stepped forward before Ambassador Chai could stop her, and her voice was steady when she spoke. I would like to try, she said simply. The great hall fell completely silent. And even Cthulhu paused his flowing motion to regard this small human woman who had dared to challenge the unchallengeable. Try what? Exactly, he asked, and she could hear amusement rippling through his gaseous form. Yuna unwrapped the cloth covering her grandmother's sword and let the ancient blade catch the light of the station's artificial sun. I would like to try cutting you, she answered. And the silence that followed was the loudest thing she had ever heard.